Great to be here. Now, I am Canadian, as Rod mentioned, which means I'm immensely proud of the sacrifices of Canadian servicemen in the 2 world wars. However, I must apologize for Justin Trudeau, so sorry about So my talk today is going to be entitled Emergent Authoritarianism, and I raised this theme in an unheard piece that I wrote a few days ago. And the argument here is that authoritarianism, what Muhammad talked about, the threats to liberty, increasingly the threats to liberty and solidarity are not coming from government, but from below, from institutions and peer-to-peer social interactions, online and in person as well. The question is, what do we do about this emergent authoritarianism? Now, the ideology behind the new emergent authoritarianism is what I call cultural socialism. The thing about cultural socialism is you can be Jeff Bezos, you can be Mark Zuckerberg and be a cultural socialist. It has nothing really to do with economic redistribution. But it is drawn from a very similar principle, which is to do with leveling hierarchies and redistributing. What's emerging increasingly is a new culture war between cultural liberalism and solidarity on the one hand, which stands for free speech, due process, equal treatment, scientific method, and on the other, cultural socialism, which sees society as a hierarchy of identity groups in which those that have privilege, defined in identity terms as white and male and straight, need to be attacked in order to somehow raise the self-esteem, the power, and perhaps the resource level of groups that are at the bottom of this supposed hierarchy. This culture war is being waged not by the right, but really by the cultural socialist left. It's activists acting on institutions to get them to change their policies in the direction of quote-unquote critical social justice, i.e. cultural socialism. And at the sort of religious core of cultural socialism is wokeness. Wokeness is not just a pejorative term, it has actually got a real meaning. And the definition that I've used several times of wokeness in one sentence, the sacralization of historically disadvantaged race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That is wokeness. That means that if you offend the most sensitive member of one of these totemic groups, you have committed blasphemy. If you criticize any policy designed in whatever way, even though it won't actually help these groups, if it's supposedly in favor of these groups, if you criticize a policy like affirmative action or microaggressions, that makes you a racist, a transphobe, etc. So we have cultural socialism as this driving ideology behind the new emergent authoritarianism. The first casualty of this is free speech and liberty. Half of British people in a survey say they feel less free to express themselves than they did 5 years ago. This question has been asked in the United States since 1954. In 1954, only 13% of people said they weren't free to speak their mind. As recently as 1987, only 20% of Americans said they didn't feel free to speak their mind. That number is now in the range of 40 to 50%. So we are 3 times less free in the United States, and I would argue in Britain as well, than in 1954 in terms of freedom to express your opinions. But more than the loss of freedom is the downstream effect of this new cultural socialism. And this cultural socialism privileges the self-esteem, the so-called power of identity groups. It tends to see culture as the driving force in maintaining these hierarchies. That means place names, statues, words like master bedroom or spooky. All of these things enact this invisible matrix which somehow leads to this oppression which we can't quite measure or test or falsify, but it's there. It's called structural, you name it, racism, patriarchy, etc. And if we have to take away the speech rights of dominant groups, those who have fewer intersectional points on the totem pole, whites, males, straights, we have to take their freedom of speech away in order to achieve the self-esteem boost that we need. Well, we're going to do that. And that leads to the progressive illiberalism that we increasingly see, especially in universities, but increasingly in other organizations and in the general culture as well. The effects go well beyond the threat to liberalism, however. The threats, the closing down of debate over a whole series of issues due to cultural socialism in elite institutions means we can no longer have an honest debate about crime, borders, homelessness, group inequality, education, integration. A whole range of different topics go unaddressed because there are certain opinions which are unsayable. And the Overton window of acceptable political discourse has been narrowed so much that we can't actually get at what's going on here. In addition, cultural socialism is being used to attack what is perceived as the national identity of privileged groups through attacks on statues, renaming of buildings, and implementing a grievance-centered view of history in schools, in the media, and in official pronouncements. So there we have cultural socialism, the driving force behind the new illiberalism and behind the divisiveness of this campaign to erase traditional national identities. The tools that the new cultural socialism uses are emergent. They come from below. They're not the government so much. And this is what's tricky for some people to understand. If you think about a flock of birds or a school of fish, what is it that keeps the flock together? It's not a lead bird telling every bird what to do and punishing them if they get out of line. It is that everybody has internalized a set of rules as to where to be in the flock. And so the flock has emergent properties and it behaves as a flock, as a collectivity, because of the behavior of the birds underneath, the simple behavior. And that really explains what happens on a campus, for example. Everybody knows the rules of discourse, the rules of political correctness, and so you get conformity to social justice ideology emerging from below. And it is enforced, yes, through speech policing, but it is also enforced because everybody knows if they step out of line, they will be policed by the woke mob, for example. And so that is an emergent authoritarianism from below, and that's quite different from the Chinese form of authoritarianism, which uses the state to spy on you, throw you in jail, and so on. But it is still authoritarianism. It's an attack on free speech, due process, equal treatment, scientific rationality, all of the things which Jonathan Rauch in his new book calls the constitution of knowledge. So this new cultural socialism is being implemented from below. What are its techniques? Well, one of the techniques is to capture and corrupt existing institutions like universities, corporations. It uses disciplinary action. I've been hauled in a number of times into internal disciplinary procedures because of a complaint on Twitter or some radical student activist or radical faculty member. Disciplinary action, compelled speech through diversity statements. Now, a study was done of U.S. academic jobs. 1 in 5 now require you to fill out an equity and diversity statement. If you don't pass that, you are not eligible to be considered for the job. A survey that I conducted showed 1 in 3 American doctoral students in academics who are conservative say they have either been disciplined or threatened with discipline for speech in teaching, research, or elsewhere. Social media mobs operate below, shaming and conducting cancel campaigns. Between 2015 and 2020, the number of firing campaigns on American campuses jumped 5-fold. 1 in 3 British academics report that they self-censor. So we have a very powerful bottom-up conformity driven by this emergent authoritarianism from cultural socialist activists. The impact can be seen not just on campus, but wider in everyday life, in other organizations, not just large corporations, but even in daily life. 8 in 10 conservative Americans say the current political climate prevents them from expressing their opinion. 6 in 10 of all Americans, according to a Cato survey of 2020. So what do we do then about emergent authoritarianism and cultural socialism? A cultural socialism which is leading to a loss of freedom, a loss of solidarity across Western societies. The first point to note is that government is a very important, in fact, the most important part of the solution. Why? How can this be? How can government be a solution to illiberalism? Well, if you think of society not as 2 levels, government and citizens, but as 3 levels. Government institutions, government bodies, universities, firms in the middle, and then citizens. It's the middle level of institutions That is where most of the constraints on your freedom are coming from, driven by activist pressure from below. The government stands above those institutions. It has a role in stepping in, like a corrupt police department or a corrupt school, to interdict what they're doing and to protect liberty. And I'm going to try and give you a few examples of where I think government needs to go on this. The first is ensuring protection for freedom of speech, and the second is ensuring protection from political discrimination. The first is a civil liberties issue. The second is a civil rights issue. So in terms of free speech, I think one of the strongest, one of the policies of this in government that I heartily endorse, and I have been involved in this fight, is the Academic Freedom Bill, which will mandate universities to protect, not just protect, but to promote academic freedom. They can be fined if they do not promote and protect academic freedom. Moreover, guidance can be issued from the new Academic Freedom Director, which will tell universities which policies are non-compliant and which policies supersede others. That is, you can no longer say that some notion of harassment based on people feeling offended or the university's reputation being sullied because a few Twitter activists have said some nasty things. That is no longer justification for throwing an academic under the bus. So universities are going to have to behave on free speech, and I think that's extremely important. I think there's a lot further to go on this. I think the Equalities 2010 Act, for example, doesn't specify clearly enough, and certainly the agencies issuing guidance don't specify clearly enough that this cannot be used to supersede free speech. So government has a role then in ensuring that people aren't disciplined for legal speech. But in addition, I think, more importantly, there is a new role for government to tackle political discrimination, and I think this is a very, very important point. Many UK organizations, I would argue most of them, are actually practicing political discrimination, particularly against conservatives, but also other dissenting political views such as gender-critical feminism. Many directives simply aren't politically neutral, and these are enforced by peers. So in universities, I found, for example, that 1 in 3 academics surveyed in our policy exchange report on academic freedom in the UK of 2020, 1 in 3 academics polled said they wouldn't hire a known leaver for a job. It was revealed through a survey method that they would not hire a known Leave supporter for a job. In the US, 40% of academics wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter for a job. This is political discrimination, and it is illegal in Britain now. A very important case, the Forstater case, which you may be familiar with. Political belief is a protected category. You are not allowed to discriminate on the grounds of political belief, and it's happening all the time. Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which are spreading like wildfire in universities and elsewhere, as currently practiced, are politically discriminatory against conservatives and against any classical liberal who doesn't believe that differences in group outcomes of income, of status, are solely attributable to discrimination. And yet, if you don't believe that, you're going against the values of your institution. So this is coercive, compelled speech, and needs to be tackled. Tech firms, in their algorithms, to the extent those algorithms are not treating the extreme right and the extreme left equally, they're not treating people in Western countries and those in other countries equally, that also needs to be tackled. Those algorithms, because tech firms are common carriers, they should be regulated. Their algorithms should be transparent and open to scrutiny by regulators to ensure that they are not engaging in political discrimination. We need to use Ofsted, the OFS, other regulators to go after political discrimination in the classroom. For example, with critical race theory and some of the concepts that come out of that. In online platforms, in diversity training, in organizational messaging. Organizations should be aiming for political neutrality, particularly if they are government organizations. They should not be taking an opinion on Brexit, on BLM, on a whole series of political issues. They should be not claiming that this university's values are critical social justice. The university's values should be about pursuit of truth and academic freedom. So what's missing then politically here is a party that's willing to make this cultural battle, this culture war, between cultural socialism on the one hand and cultural liberalism and solidarity on the other, needs to raise that issue, to be central to its campaign messaging. And this is one of the reasons I would fault the Conservative Party. Now, the Conservatives have made some important steps in the last 2 years. As I say, academic freedom, museums, and a few other places. They have done some things, but this is all on the quiet. Very little of it. There has been a few speeches, but what they're not willing to do is elevate this cultural battle front and center in their campaigning. And I believe that some party needs to do this. I think the SDP is well placed to do this. These culture war issues are going to be extremely important. They're already extremely important. They're already a vote winner because they split left-wing voters and they unite most culturally conservative voters. We saw that in the recent race in Virginia, where Glenn Youngkin flipped a very Democratic state by 2.5 points, a state Joe Biden won by 10 points in 2020. And we saw in a number of other places in the United States major upsets for the radical left. This showed the power of woke, if you like, or anti-woke, if you like, issues, in this case around critical race theory in education. For parties, if parties can get a hold of this issue, it is a powerful issue that they can use to win over centrist liberals who are concerned about the attacks on free speech, about the political discrimination, about the attack on freedom of conscience that is being waged in our institutions, whether they be educational, corporate, etc. Now, some claim fighting the culture war is divisive and ungentlemanly. I would suggest to you that these people are actually the useful idiots of the woke revolution. Because we have to remember the culture war has been started by cultural socialists, the cultural left, in our institutions. They are the ones who have started this divisive campaign. The actions of governments, such as the Academic Freedom Bill or bans on critical race theory in schools, not universities, in schools, those actions are defensive, and they are designed in a way to remove policies which are causing immense amount of division. So these are defensive acts to reclaim our institutions for the moderate mainstream, and those are going to improve solidarity as well as liberty, not cause more division. I don't have much time, but I don't think we have much time either. If you look, every survey I've looked at, I do a lot of survey work, I'm a social scientist, but every survey I've looked at, the under 30s are twice as intolerant, or at least twice as intolerant as the over 50s on all these questions. And that is not because they're younger. We have survey evidence from the 1970s. That evidence tells us that the emerging millennial generation, which is going to become more and more important for voting, is a much more intolerant generation than the generations which preceded them. The problem of cancel culture, of cultural socialism, is going to get worse, not better. It is important for you to disabuse yourself of the idea that this is a McCarthyist moment. It is not. It is structural, and part of the it is a feature, not a bug in a way, of the times we're living in. And only by elevating these cultural questions to the center of democratic debate can we defeat emergent authoritarianism. Now, it may be that we choose to go for critical social justice and cultural socialism as a democracy, and if as a democracy we collectively decide that, fine. At least we'll have had the debate. But for this not to be debated, for this just to go on behind closed doors, is, I think, a failure of democracy. Thank you very much.